Hello, this is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high-quality racing oil for your two-stroke or four, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support. Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazer, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at another one of my classic magazines. For this one, I'm going a little bit more of a deep cut. Actually, this magazine's a little bit before my time. I really didn't get into motocross until the early 80s, but over the years, I've kind of filled in my back catalog of magazines. And what we're going to do here is look at one from 1976. This one is the November 1976 issue of Motocross Action. Motocross Action certainly has changed a great deal over the years. This is the early days, although you'll notice some of the names in here, like Jody Weissel, are still at the magazine now, which is pretty amazing. But the tone of the magazine has certainly changed, and the coverage, and of course the quality. You'll notice that, probably 98% of this magazine is all in black and white, and that's one thing that's definitely changed. Although they're going to see another thing that's changed is a lot more race coverage in this. The current magazine barely has any race coverage at all. It's mostly just, tests of the latest two-stroke. The magazine still exists, and I certainly hope it does continue to do so in the future. Motocross Action is actually one of the few magazines I still subscribe to and get the physical copy of. So I've always loved this magazine. I love looking at these old ones, and they're really cool, and I hope I can add a little something. This is a little different. Like some of the later ones, I have a little more, I guess I have a little more perspective on, or I can add a little more to them. A lot of these people and some of the stories in here I'm not familiar with, other than just reading it this first time, going through it. They're not as, again, I didn't read it when it was new. I wasn't getting Motocross Action. I was 6 years old when this magazine came out, so I wasn't getting it at that point. My parents weren't into motocross. I really didn't even know it existed at that point, other than maybe around 77, my neighbor had like a new YZ125, and I saw him going up and down the backyard with it, but that's about the extent of what I knew about motocross at that point. At this point, I was into bicycles and stuff. I really didn't have any understanding of motocross, but later on, that passion grew with me, and then over time, I've kind of filled in, as I said, my back catalog of some of these old magazines I didn't have. So I'm going to go through this one just like I did on the others. I'm going to go through page by page, and we'll talk a little bit about some things I might have a little more to say about others. Other pages we might go back pretty quickly, but I'm also going to upload a complete PDF of this issue. So if you want to read the entire thing, I'm going to put it on my website, themotocrossvault.com, and you can go through the entire thing just like I am here. So if people like them, I'll continue to do them. If you'd like to support the channel, I have Motocross Vault merch available. This is my new FMF 1998 design based on the Honda CRs they ran that year, the retro model they ran at Glen Helen. I think it's very cool. I just came out with a new Ricky Carmichael design based on his 2005 Makita Suzuki. I love that one. I think it turned out really well. You can also find, of course, many other designs. I probably have 20 or 30 at this point. I did one on the evolution of Suzuki's motocross machines, Yamaha, Honda, and Kawasaki, and I probably will be doing one on KTM as well for you KTM aficionados out there. Here's the story of the November 1976 issue of Motocross Action. All right, here we go. We're going to get into the November 1976 issue of Motocross Action. On the cover, we have a photo of Pierre Karsmakers, who was riding for Factory Honda at the time. I believe this photo is from the Super Bowl of Motocross in 1976. One interesting thing, check out the cool forks on Pierre's bike. It looks like the fork boots, it looks like they're about twice the length of the forks. I guess maybe the fork slider is compressed up into the boot and it stayed extended. It's kind of a strange look. This is actually, I believe he's running an early version of the cartridge forks that would eventually make their debut on the standard production Hondas 10 years after this. So these works bikes in the early to mid 70s were so trick. They had so much technology on them. Honda even played with the idea of putting fuel injection on some of these way back in the mid 70s. So really neat machines, and even at this point, Honda was producing some pretty trick stuff. On the inside cover here, you have an ad for Miller Mano. Now, Dave Miller, he just recently passed away. I'm so sorry to tell you anybody that who didn't know, but he was the man behind Miller Mano and later DMC, Dave Miller Concepts. And I believe this was the first company he started selling all kinds of hop-up stuff here for, it looks like mainly Suzuki's in this ad, but they have DMC later. I always thought of them as a Kawasaki provider, but I imagine Dave probably did stuff for everybody. Here on the table of contents, you have a test of the all-new Suzuki RM250A. This is the first year for the RMs in the 250 class, at least. They had released a 125 the year before this. There's also coverage of the Mid-Ohio USGP, the Women's National Motocross, the Super Bowl of Motocross, some GP coverage as well. And then you have a couple of articles one on two-stroke tuning, and another one on a hop-up for the XR75. Here on page 4, we get On the Main Jet by Dick Miller, who is a name that's certainly well known in early motocross circles. Dick Miller has a lot of the classic photography you're going to see on Racer X now. If they show an older photo, a lot of them are by Dick Miller. I think they got his archive. I assume he's passed on now. I'm not sure, but his name is really significant in the early days of motocross. High Torque Publishing is still doing motocross action to this day. I'm not sure if they've ever been bought out or changed hands, but it's pretty impressive. The magazine is continuing to be in production to this day. In 1976, you could get a 12-month subscription of Motocross Action for a whopping $9, and I don't think that's a whole lot more than they cost now. So it's pretty amazing. It seems like a pretty good value these days, which is probably a good reason why the motocross industry and the magazine industry, you don't see too many motocross magazines thriving these days. On the next page here, we have a ad for Cross Up Inc. It looks like they are building a lot of pretty trick swing arms. Got to remember at this point, most motocross bikes, and maybe all of them, were using steel swing arms. Alloy stuff was, on works bikes and what have you, but you would not have saw that on a production machine. And it looks like they have some pretty cool stuff from pipes and upgraded swing arms and what have you can get from them. On page 8, we have Baz's box, which is, I said, Paul Boudreau, who was a really influential guy early on in the days of motocross action. Came back, and I think he did a column for Racer X. I don't know, it's maybe 10 years ago, I'm not sure. But anyway, he was definitely one of the bigger names in the early days of motocross action, what have you. There's a really neat little cartoon here. I think it's Gary Simix at the bottom. On the right here, you have an ad for a side hack bicycle. I've literally never seen that before. I wasn't aware that side hack bicycling was a thing. I mean, it's not like it's not hard enough to pedal just yourself, but you're going to bring somebody else along. That's pretty crazy. I can't believe that they actually raced it. It's funny, sidecar thing was, even sidecar motocross seemed to have been a pretty big thing in the 70s. It's one of those, I assume they still do it, but you just don't see it anymore. It was kind of went out of style. I always thought it was kind of peculiar, but you could get a free White Lightning, free giveaway here for a White Lightning bicycle, which I would have loved to have had in 1976, certainly. On page 10, we get the dirt section. Now, this is a good look at exactly the kind of tone difference that motocross action had in these early days. You have a girl here with a wet t-shirt on from, I guess, a Bassani exhaust, some kind of event or something. I don't know. But you would definitely not have seen this in the 90s. So at some point, motocross action took a turn where they didn't want cigarette ads. They didn't want any kind of nudity. Or not, well, this wasn't really nudity, but any kind of raciness. I remember the old Extreme shirts that have like censored plastered across them. But you look at these early ones from the 70s, and they have all kinds of pictures of what they call pit tootsies in here, and butt shots and boob shots and everything else. So at some point they made a turn there. I'm not sure what precipitated it. Maybe Roland Hines, I think. Maybe he was a more religious fellow or something when he came on board as the editor, kind of changed the tone of things. I believe is what happened, but it's always kind of interesting to see how much different these motocross actions are from the 70s versus later years. Now, in the mail entry section on page 12, this is obviously riders reading or readers writing into the magazine. I enjoy these from time to time. There's some witty stuff in here, but for the most part, it's mostly nonsense. Now, on the page 13, though, there is a cool ad for Myerscough machines. Brian Myerscough was a top pro and a factory rider in the early 80s, and I can only assume maybe his parents had ran Myerscough machines. I saw another one of these early 70s issues where they tested a YZ80 that had been hopped up, very similar to the one there on the right. And I really don't remember any of this. Again, this is before my time. So many times you see these guys that turn out to be really great racers, like guys like Jeff Ward. Their parents had kind of hop-up shops or what have you. And I guess Brian's dad probably had some high-performance stuff he did for minis back in the day. I just don't remember this. It's neat, though, to see. I assume there's some connection there. On page 14, we have a wingnut column by Al Baker, and it looks like people are writing into him. Now, if you're not familiar with Al Baker was the guy behind XR's Only, which was a really prominent Honda four-stroke hop-up shop in the 80s. He was also the man that helped bring the original Mugen that Johnny O'Mara raced to the U.S. He was a distributor for the Mugens when they first came to the U.S. in, I think, 1980. So Al Baker was a big-time important figure in motocross and off-road racing for many years, and he passed away. I'm trying to remember. I think he passed away in an ultralight accident, but I'm not positive on that. It's been a few years back, but I know he's no longer with us, which is a bad deal. On page 15, we have a ad for R&R BMX racing products. This BMX bike, I would have killed for have this. I would have killed to have this bike back then. I was riding a banana-seated, ape-hangered bike from Kmart, I think, in 1976. It was pretty cheeseball looking. It certainly wasn't anything as cool as this with those mag wheels and what have you. This is a really cool BMX bike for the time. Bicycle motocross. I'm sure it was probably big in California at the time. I lived here in Virginia, and I didn't know anybody doing it. Of course, we all wanted bicycles like this, but I never attended any races or did any bicycle motocrossing myself. Here on page 16, we have the whips column, which is looking at a couple of the personalities of motocross. Motocross Action still does something similar to this now, though I don't remember what they call it off the top of my head. But this is looking at a couple of people. One of these guys is, I guess, a friend of Gaston Reher, rode for his team, I guess, at the USGP. A gentleman by the name of Francois Mine, I guess that's how you say it. I've actually never heard of Francois, so I'm not sure. Again, this is kind of before my time, so some of these less well-known riders I may not remember off the top of my head. This the young lady in the middle is Joanne Miley. Apparently, she was one of the top women motocrossers at the time. She was a hairdresser from San Juan Capistrano. It's pretty interesting. This magazine, you'll see later, they actually cover women's motocross, and I looked at several of these, and there's actually quite a bit of women's motocross coverage in these mid-70s motocross actions, which it's pretty interesting. Women's motocross had a little renaissance, I guess, in the late 2000s, when we had got like ladies like Ashley Filick doing so well. But for many years they were kind of off the radar. But I guess this was a fairly prominent, fairly prominent series in this at this point in the mid 70s. The last guy is Karl-Heinz Hensner. Sorry if I'm butchering your name there, Carl. Looks like he was a mechanic for guys like Out of Wheel. Another gentleman I've never heard of. He might have retired before I kind of got into motocross. Here on page 17, you have a ad for quality shirts and unique designs. I'm sure some of these shirts, like that Trans AMA one, actually I would love to have that right now. The thing is pretty cool design. I would definitely rock that now. Here on page 18, we have some tricks of the trade. Again, a thing you're still going to see for many years in motocross action, kind of highlighting different products and what have you. I have no idea what the heck's going on with that heat feed. Is it some kind of a heater for your feet? I don't know. You can get a CCM Works replica. At this point, four-stroke motocross was kind of really a niche thing. Everybody basically gone two-stroke by the mid-70s. And you still had a few manufacturers like CCM. I think they bought some of the stuff from BSA when BSA went under. And they still continued to build some machines. But it was definitely clearly out of the mainstream here by the mid-70s. You can get yourself some Barum tires, which the only thing I remember from Barum tires is they came standard on like the 89 CZ. When CZ came out with some basically 1976 models in 1989, they had Barum tires on them. And I remember thinking, what the hell's a Barum tire? But I guess they were a prominent manufacturer at some point. Here on page 20, we have an ad for some kind of a Bowflexy type thing. I guess you're supposed to turn into this bodybuilder guy. I remember these ads. Clearly, I'm not the bodybuilder type, so I never had one myself. The Bullworker. I do remember the ad, but I've never actually seen this thing in action. I'm not sure how it worked, but it does look kind of like a Bowflex type deal. Starting on page 21, we have an article by E.C. Britt on two-stroke tuning. And this would obviously not be as helpful these days with everything going four-stroke, but I'm sure at the time this is a pretty helpful article for somebody looking to get a start tuning their bikes. Looks like it's pretty in-depth. I actually didn't really read much about it. I've never been a two-stroke tuner. I've never done any porting myself or anything like that. I've always been afraid to dig into the motor. This would definitely be above my skill level. I would definitely have some concerns about pulling out a set of drills and starting grinding away. But I'm sure if you were a young Eric Gore or something, this was probably a pretty cool article to read in 1976. All right, starting on page 26, we have coverage by the Bazzer of the 1976 Mid-Ohio United States Grand Prix. Now, this is in the days when the Grand Prix races, when they'd come to the U.S., were a big deal. Again, the Europeans were really considered dominant in many parts of the sport. Although the 125 class, maybe not quite as much. We had some guys like Bob Hanna coming in the class in '76, and Marty Smith, who was a two-time champ at this point, which were more competitive, I think, than maybe in the big bore classes where the 500s were a little tougher at the time. They were kind of the premier division. But back in these days, the USGP was a big deal. I was lucky enough to get to go to, I don't know, 2 or 3 of them in the early to mid 90s when they went to Budds Creek, and I always loved going there and seeing the totally different bikes, the works bikes, and all these riders that I couldn't even pronounce their name. It was just really cool, and I'm sure it was really awesome. I never got to go to one of these Mid-Ohio races, but looks like it was a really amazing event at the time. Now this race at the time, Gaston Reher was kicking everybody's butt in the 125s, and he was considered the favorite coming into this, but Marty Smith ended up upsetting him. Apparently, Bob Hanna and Marty put on quite a show. Marty this year was having a little bit of struggles. They had come out with a new, what they call the Type 2. In 1976, Honda came out with all new works bikes. And I think the open bikes were really successful, but there were a lot of problems with Marty's 125. His RC 125 had a lot of mechanical issues, and really were it kind of like held him back from being able to repeat as champ in '76. Although I'm sure Bob Hanna would probably feel differently, but he had a lot of problems on that bike. And at Mid-Ohio here, apparently he brought both the Type 2, the Japanese full works prototype, and also one that Dave Arnold had kind of cobbled together, a machine they called the X-Type, which was made from the Type 2 chassis with the old outgoing 75 motor and then some cobbled together suspension components. And he actually ended up riding this kind of Frankenstein machine at Mid-Ohio to victory. So I'm sure the bigwigs in Honda probably didn't love that, but it was good to get a victory for Marty and the home team. Love this picture here on page 28 of Marty and Bob battling. You don't think of Bob as being a 125 rider. Obviously he moved right out of the 125 class, unlike current riders like Jeremy Martin, who spend basically their career in a 125 class. In the old days, a lot of guys would quickly move up. Bob Hanna was one of those dudes. I think maybe he only raced 76. I'm not sure if maybe 1 or 2 races in 75, but he won this title in 76 and immediately moved up to the big bikes. Marty rode this class for a few years. I think he maybe moved up in 77 or so. I would definitely have liked to have gone to one of these events. The only one I've actually seen, I have a videotape that Terry Good, I think, put out of the muddy 1980 one won by Johnny O'Mara, but it's so muddy it's not so exciting to watch. But still would be great to go to one of these GP races back in the day. All right, starting on page 32, we have coverage of the IWMA Women's National Motocross Championship. Now, this was a one-day event. It was not a series per se. It was a winners-take-all one-day event, I think, held in California. Cool photo here on the left of Joanne Miley, number 39, leading Sue, who's number 35 there, and looks like a Yamaha YZ125 with the air tank forks on it. Always a really interesting year. They had those air forks in '76. And then it looks like, I think it's Nancy Thomas, looks like, on the Husqvarna. Now this, as I said, is a one-day event. Sue Fish is certainly, if you know anything about the history of women's motocross, Sue Fish was kind of the first big star that I can remember hearing the name of. Later in the 80s, Mercedes Gonzalez kind of took her place as the most preeminent woman in motocross. I can't think of anybody in the 90s so much. Now in the 2000s, of course, you had a lot of young ladies becoming pretty fast. From Jessica Patterson to Ashley Feilick, a lot of girls there as women's motocross kind of came on. But it seems like this was a pretty big deal. Like I said, there's several articles I saw on these issues in 76, 77, 78 that cover women's motocross, and that seemed to get a fair amount of coverage. So it's pretty cool for them. Sue Fish is literally the only name I know from any of these. She was kind of the one that you heard mentioned, but I guess she was pretty fast. I'm sure she would have absolutely crushed my butt. I remember I raced a young lady at Pappy Ramblers back in the 90s. I can't think of her name, but she was really fast, and she smoked me, and I was like, it was pretty humiliating. I mean, as a guy, it's pretty tough when some girl comes and kicks your butt, but you got to suck it up. You got to give them props. Sue Fish, I'm sure she was legit fast, and some of these women really haul ass. On page 36, we get coverage of the Ollie? I don't know what Ollie is. Ollie Super Bowl of Motocross. That Ollie, I guess, was the sponsor. I've seen that in some of these ads, but I, for the life of me, have no idea what OLY on Ollie was. But one thing that's interesting to note here is it looks like they ran 3 motos, kind of like the one-off race we've been doing the last couple years. And it looks like Jimmy Ellis won with a 112 score. And they actually had a 500 class this year in Supercross. You know, obviously, currently the Supercross really is a 500 class. Everybody's on 450s, but in these early days, they actually had a 250 and a 500 class. And Supercross, I don't think they had a 125 until maybe 86 was maybe the first. 85, maybe 85 was the first year they brought the 125s into Supercross. But in these early days, you had the real men on crap bikes going pretty fast in the stadiums. Here in the next page, you have a cool photo of, looks like Jimmy Ellis, number 5, Tony D, number 1, Pierre Carsmakers, number 4, and I think it's Jimmy Weiner, number 2 there. I'm not sure who number 6 is right behind Carsmakers. It's always hard to tell. It's funny to me, these early motocross, there doesn't seem to be much uniformity in terms of the numbers. The numbers are all over the place because Tony DeStefano was not the Supercross champion in 75. I'm pretty positive. This is outdoor number, but it doesn't seem like there's there's much, I guess, correlation to what the actual numbers were. I don't know how the numbering system used to work back then. You also see guys, you'll see a photo later of Bob Hanna running what looks like a black plate or a green plate in the 500 class. Like there wasn't any uniformity on the plate colors as well. So I'm always a little confused. I can't tell just to look at it, you know, what class they are and always what rider it is. The numbers just seem kind of all over the place. Here, starting on page 40, we get coverage of the 500 Grand Prix from Doddington, England. I believe I'm saying that correctly. Or Doddington Park, I guess is what it's called. Neat track, looks like. I miss tracks like this. You know, if you look at the bottom left here, they're basically just starting on an open grass field. So basically like they took you in your backyard and just started ripping around. Even on the right, you can see there's not much other than just little washboards from the poor suspension on these things. Really natural car. I'm sure it was so fun to ride these things. Even on these old bikes, it would have been a hoot to ride them on these tracks. Apparently, they only used the Doddington Park race once a year, very much like Unadil at the time. So it must have been a pretty fun event. The event was local hero Graham Noyce, who was very young at this point. He would go on to win the 500 world title maybe 3 years after this. I think 79 is when he won it. But he won the first moto. And it was, at the time, I don't think he was much of a threat for the title. DeCoster was in a pretty good battle for the points lead with Garrett Walsink, who was the known as the world's fastest dentist at the time. Other guys in the class he had to worry about were Brad Lackey. It's always funny, Brad's on a Husqvarna here, and I never think of him being on Husqvarna. He's always like a Kawasaki guy, but he did stints at Cowie, then I think Husqvarna, then he went to Factory Honda, Kawasaki, and he finally won his title on Suzuki. So Brad made the rounds there in that decade or so. He was chasing the world title. I don't guess he had a great year this year on the Husqvarna. I don't think he was much of a threat. Looks like he got a 6th here. It is interesting to see that they don't, in all these old magazines, they don't tell you who the overall winner is. I'm not sure if they did not give you an overall winner. Obviously, in motocross, you get individual points for each moto, but it doesn't tell you. It tells me who won the first moto and who won the second. It doesn't say who got the overall, so maybe they weren't doing an overall in 1976. I'm not sure. It is interesting to see. Guy on the left here, Steve Whitelock, he was the man who infamously came up with the lights name and would be running, basically screwing around with the AMA many years later. And then Pierre, of course, enjoying the Pit Tootsies here in 1976. I'm sure he had many lovely admirers here in the English heat. On the next page here, you have coverage of the 500 National from Missouri. You have a photo here of, as I said earlier, Bob Hanna, who's riding a 500 works bike, but it's basically got a black plate on it, and everybody else has white plates. You have, looks like 39's Bob, then you have 24, I think, is Galen Mosier. Gary Simics is 15, and then 94, I think, is Carsmakers. And then on the lower left here, a picture of Carsmakers and Tommy Croft on their factory Hondas. But again, there's no uniformity. Even the guy right behind Simics is running like a black plate. It's odd to me. Maybe there was no rule on what plate you had to run. It just always struck me as kind of peculiar. Hard to keep track of who's in what class and what have you when you're looking at it. In the 500 class, you had Kent Howerton. He ended up winning the 500 national title this year. This was his really great year in that Husqvarna. I think that was the last title Husqvarna won, I'm thinking, until maybe Zach Osborne, because they really weren't much of a powerhouse. Pretty much a little bit after this, they kind of started to fall behind in motocross technology, and really wasn't until the modern era with KTM buying them that they kind of got back on top. But Husqvarna was a pretty prominent brand at this point in motocross with a lot of great riders. They had Heikki Mikkola, Brad Lackey, of course, and Kent Howerton. A lot of these guys are really good on those bikes, but I think this was the last title they won this year. He would go on to win this title in 1976 on the purple Husqvarna. I always thought it was cool that the Husqvarnas had different colors. I think the 250 was red, the Husqvarna 500, or it was a 390 or whatever it was at the time, was like purple, and then the 125 was yellow. So that was a neat little tidbit there. On the next page here, we have an ad for JT Racing. You can get yourself a nice Macola glove. Those gloves really did not change in terms of the styling for many years until the mid-'80s. You saw that kind of JT Champion glove. You can get like a version with Marty Smith on it. Actually, you can see it here to the right. They have a Marty Smith one, a couple different versions. I don't think JT was quite the powerhouse they would become in the 80s at this point. They were prominent. They had come a long way from just, selling socks a few years before this. And they had a pretty good catalog here. But in the 80s, they would kind of come into their own as being really the dominant gear provider in the sport for many years. Starting on page 52, we have a test of Suzuki's all-new RM250A. Now, it's interesting because Suzuki was the first Japanese manufacturer to really take motocross seriously, and they won world titles well before any other manufacturers. But their standard bikes, the TMs at the time in the early 70s, were not particularly good bikes. They were okay for a budget racer or something, but they weren't really up to snuff at beating like any of the Europeans at the time. And this the RM line, though, when they came out with the RMs, first the 125 and 75, and then the 370 and 250 and 76, it really put Suzuki on the map as far as production machines. These were great motorcycles at the time. I would love to ride one. I've never ridden one of these. I rode the 125 years later in the 80s. A neighbor of mine had a 125, and I wasn't that impressed with it at the time, but I think one of these 370s or 250s are pretty impressive machines. I had a 78 CR250, and that thing still feels fast today. So I'm sure this thing, if it was running well and well restored, would be a pretty impressive machine. But they were great bikes. They had long travel suspension. This is the first kind of a dual shock long travel the Japanese came out with to kind of compete with Yamaha's monoshock, and Suzuki really killed it with these bikes. They were great all-around machines, and Suzuki would basically dominate production motocross for many years in the late 70s. These were the best bikes you could buy at the time, and they would be so for many years. Honda had come out really strong in 73, but they really got passed. When the RMs came out, I think the CR had about 2 inches less travel than this bike, and it was just way behind for a couple of years until they finally got with it in 78. But for many years, these RMs were great machines, and they're still popular with restorers now to this day. Here on page 58, we have a look at a hop-up of an XR75 pit bike. This is interesting. The XR75 was actually considered a pretty legit mini racer for a few years in the early 70s. It was actually Honda's first kind of serious dirt bike. Prior to the XR75, they really didn't. They had SLs and a bunch of other little kind of really converted street bikes. Weren't much in the way of off-road machines. But this XR75 actually predated the CR Elsinore's introduction by a little bit, and it was considered a really great bike for many years. By the time the early 80s came around, of course, they were completely outdated. And the advent of the RM80 and the YZ80 kind of quickly eclipsed its performance, but people still loved them as pit bikes, and they became a huge rage in the late 70s. Guys, converting these things into long travel suspended, really trick pit bikes to race, kind of like what happened with the 50s and the 2000s there. But this is an article telling you how to get a little better suspension performance out of your XR. I would love to have one of these things. They're really neat machines, and really like even the modern CRF kind of use, I think, the same basic engine. It's not really that changed from what they had back here in 76. Here on page 60, we get a bunch of, I guess looks like t-shirts, tees and sweatshirts you can get. Unlike that other one I thought were pretty cool, I don't see any of these that I'm very much interested in. Certainly not a Choppers one or a big old Harley Davidson one. I think I'll pass. Although Mathis might like the Canada one here on the left. On the right, you have IRC tires. I ran IRC Vulcan Duros. They were a great budget tire in the late 80s. I remember I always ran those things because they were about half the price of a Dunlop, and they seemed to wear pretty well. And when you're a kid in high school, cheap and long wearing takes precedent over performance for sure, especially if you weren't racing like me. On page 62, we get an ad for the dirt bike calendar. I actually have almost all these dirt bike calendars. I've acquired them over the years from eBay, and they're really cool. I wish they still did stuff like this. They had a lot of action shots that maybe were taken for different articles and didn't make it into the article, so there's a lot of cool stuff in them. I enjoy looking back at them. Another cool cartoon here. I'm not sure who did this one, but there's some cool cartoon stuff in some of these older magazines. These color posters, I wish you could still get some of these. None of these are particularly interesting, but I always wanted that one of Hannah jumping out of Gravity Cavity and stuff. I'm sure if you had any one of these posters now, they're probably worth a fair amount of money. Certainly worth more than $7.50. Here on page 64, we have an ad for Hallman Racing, and which is now Thor. Torsten Hallman Original Racewear is the acronym that Thor stands for. Torsten Hallman was a multi-time world champion, one of the great riders from Sweden in the 60s, and one of the pioneers of bringing motocross to the U.S. And in the 70s, Hallman was one of the major importers. They imported all kinds of stuff. And Trelleborg tires here is one of them. Now, it's interesting. It says here that Trelleborg tires have won all these world championships. Nearly every world championship has been won on Trelleborg tires since the introduction in '69. Now, that's amazing. I would never have guessed that. To me, Trelleborg tires were these weird tires that came with spikes in them, like metal screws for riding in the winter. When I grew up in the 80s, that's what you saw Trelleborg for. I don't even know if they're still around. Maybe they're still over in Europe. I'm not sure, but I'm not thinking anybody's winning world titles on Trelleborg anymore, but I guess they were a big deal in '76. On the right here, you have a really cool ad for Al Baker, his performance stuff. Again, he would be XRs Only, the guy behind XRs Only in the 80s, where you get some really cool XRs with all kinds of cool hop-up stuff on them. And I guess Al, looks like he's focusing mainly on RMs. You could get a fully kitted RM. How'd you like a fully kitted RM370 for 1985 with all this upgrades on it? I wish the heck I could have that bike now. That thing is so cool. But Al Baker, like I said, he was a really significant figure in motocross for many years. Here on page 66, we get a look at the Motocross Champions book. I've seen this on eBay a couple of times. I never picked one up. If anybody has one, let me know if it's worth getting. I'm not sure if there's much in there except just a bunch of black and white photos. People typically want a lot of money for them, so I've kind of shied away from it. I'm not sure how much good stuff's in it. You have the ad for the Motocross Tricks for 1976 from Motocross Fox. I would love to have that catalog. I have a few catalogs from Motocross Fox in the late 70s, and there's some really neat stuff in there. I wish I had a few more. It's always, if you find one on eBay, people want a lot of money for them, so it's kind of hard to pick them up now. But I wouldn't mind having a cool motocross racing jersey either. That'd be pretty cool. You can get one of those. Here on page 68, we have an ad for Team Jaffa. I think Jaffa was I'm thinking a manufacturer of stuff for hockey originally. And some of those pads clearly look like kind of like hockey pads and what have you. But they were, the Jaffa mouthguard was like the iconic thing everybody ran for many years, and until full face helmets kind of came into vogue in the mid 80s. Number products down here at the bottom. Never heard of them. Don't know what they do. I imagine they're probably still not around. Auto reports. Don't know what the hell that is either. Now here on page 70, Oakley. If you think about Oakley and what an incredible powerhouse they are now, and known well outside of the motocross, not even known for motocross really anymore. More people know Oakley probably for other kind of action sports and what have you now. But Oakley started as a motocross company. They were a hardcore motocross company, and they were known for their grips. These I think they were called B1s, but I remember these grips wanting them for my bicycle at the time. They were really really cool, and then Oakley would eventually expand into goggles and glasses and many other things. But early on, I think their product that got them started here was the Oakley grip, and this might have been right at the very beginning in 1976. This is pretty early stuff. This prototype prototype. Now this one on this Husqvarna here they show in the ad is not that interesting, but I found another one of these where they actually sold an up pipe. If you figured that for the CR125 in 1976 and 77, the CR125 unbelievably still had a downpipe on it like it was a bike from the 60s, and Prototype made a up pipe for the CR125 that I thought was pretty slick, and I would like to have had it. You know what's funny about these? You look at that pipe is fully exposed, and I would just be so worried about roasting my leg on that thing. Some of these early bikes, they just had that thing hanging out in the wind, and I don't know how you kept from turning your knee to meat on the damn thing. Here on the next page, on page 72, we have, looks like some more ads for stuff for stickers and what have you. The classifieds. There's actually not much of a classifieds in this. It seems like later on they get the more expansive section where I'd go and you'd find all kinds of different smaller ads for different things. I love this picture on 74 of the berm shot. It's a picture of Sue Fish winning the women's title and a couple of her buddies mooning her. Pretty hilarious. Makes me think of Frank Thomas telling his son to go home, and pretty entertaining that somebody took this. I guess it was it looks like Bazzer shot this photo, so pretty interesting photo, and congratulations Sue Fish. I'm sure she appreciated that from her buddies. And here on the last page of the magazine we have a catalog for race winning tricks. I guess it looks like they're selling a bunch of stuff for Suzuki's, and I don't remember Motocross Center and their race winning tricks. I don't know if they're still around. I'm thinking probably not around. And on the back cover, we have an ad for DG. DG was a major motocross powerhouse in the mid 70s. They sponsored guys like Bob Hanna, and they had some really great stuff, really cool stuff. They had packaged mini racers and sold stuff like you can see, like these swing arms and just all kinds of cool stuff. Their porcupine heads were just like the coolest thing to have. I always wanted one of those things. Really neat. And then they, I'm not sure if it's got bought out or what happened. They kind of transitioned to basically going ATV only in the 80s, and it seemed like they kind of lost focus on motocross. Although you still saw, I think they actually sponsored Ty Davis on his way to the 1990 Supercross title, beating Jeremy McGrath. The last guy to beat Jeremy in the 125 class there was, I think, Ty Davis. But DG, I think they're still around. I did get a DG pipe. I know they were a manufacturer. You could get pipes for old bikes. When I had my 83 480, the only people making a pipe for it were DG. So I think that's kind of their niche these days. But in any case, if you've enjoyed this, make sure you check out some of the others. I'd love to know if there's some other magazines you'd like me to do going forward. So there you have it. That's a look back at the November 1976 issue of Motocross Action. I love these old magazines. I love going back and reading them. And if you have suggestions for other ones you'd like me to cover, please put them in the comments section below. I read all the comments. I respond. I love the interaction we get here on YouTube and on social media. I very much appreciate it. If you could subscribe, like, share on social media as well, I would very much appreciate it. Ding that little bell to make sure you get notified when we do a new video. And again, I love the suggestions. I try to fill them as we go. As long as I have the information, I'll be happy to do a review on something. I have a lot of them in the works. I've done a lot of classic steels for over at pulpmx.com. And once I've got the research, the pictures and everything, that's the easy part. Putting the video together is actually not that hard. The hard part is the thousands of hours of scanning and finding stuff and everything else that goes into it. So once I have all the information, I have a pretty easy time putting something together. The rest of it's pretty time consuming. So, but if you have one in particular you would like to see me do, let me know that in the comment section below, and I'll definitely add it to the queue. See if I can. If I have the information, I will definitely do it in the future. So, thank you for all the support, and until we meet again, this is Tony Blazer from the Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.